perpetrate a hoax, believing that no serious efforts would ever be taken to verify their stories. In preparing this report, attempts were made not to only explain what conclusions were reached, but how they were reached. This undertaking was to try to demystify the research process by outlining the simple and logical research techniques that identified the underlying actual events. In regard to statements of witnesses that were clearly descriptions of Air Force activities, such as those that described anthropomorphic dummies, these could be generously viewed as situational misunderstandings or even honest mistakes. Other descriptions, particularly those believed to be thinly veiled references to deceased or injured Air Force members, are difficult to view as naive misunderstandings. Any attempt to misrepresent or capitalize on tragic incidents in which Air Force members died or were injured in service to their country significantly alters what would otherwise be viewed as simple misinterpretations or honest mistakes. Finally, after reviewing this report, some persons may legitimately ask why the Air Force expanded time and effort to respond to mythical, if not comedic, allegations of recoveries of flying saucers and space aliens. The answer to those persons is, initially the Air Force was required to respond to an official request from the General Accounting Office. High-altitude balloon research, aircraft escape systems, and other technologies that were misrepresented as part of the Roswell incident accounted for significant contributions to the knowledge of the atmosphere, to the quest for spaceflight, and to the defense of this nation. Out of these accomplishments, distorted and incomplete descriptions of these activities do not pay tribute to these important exploits or to the individuals who, often at great personal risk, boldly carried them out. A sobering reality of the mission of the U.S. Air Force, as evidenced by the aircraft mishaps described in this report, is that defending this nation is a dangerous profession. On a daily basis, members of the U.S. Air Force perform hazardous missions in many locations throughout the world. Unfortunately, these missions sometimes result in injuries or deaths. It is the right, and indeed the duty, of the Air Force to challenge those who attempt to exploit these human tragedies wherever and whenever they are discovered. The misrepresentations of Air Force activities as an extraterrestrial incident is misleading to the public and is simply an affront to the truth. This comprehensive further examination of the so-called Roswell incident found no evidence whatsoever of flying saucers, space aliens, or sinister government cover-ups. But, even if unintentionally, it did serve to highlight a series of events that embody the proud history of the finest Air Force in the world, the U.S. Air Force. The actual events examined here, rich in human and scientific triumph, tempered by the stark realities of the dangers of the Air Force mission, are but one small portion of that history. The many Air Force activities cobbled together in the ever-changing collage that has become the Roswell incident, when examined in the clear light of historical research, revealed a remarkable chapter of the Air Force story. In the final analysis, this examination simply illustrates once again that fact is indeed stranger and often much more fascinating than fiction. End of Section 9. Recording by Aaron Bennett. Section 10 of the Roswell Report, Case Closed, by James McAndrew. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Aaron Bennett. The Roswell Report, Case Closed, by James McAndrew. Appendix B, Part 1, Witness Statements. Appendix B, Statement of Witness. Date 26 April 1996. Place Farmington, New Mexico. I, Charles E. Clouthier, hereby state that James McAndrew was identified as a captain, U.S. Air Force Reserve, on this date at my place of employment, do hereby, voluntarily, and of my own free will, make the following statement. This was done without having been subjected to any coercion, unlawful influence, or unlawful inducement. I was on active duty in the U.S. Air Force and stationed at Walker Air Force Base, Roswell, New Mexico, from February 1955 until October 1956. During that time, I was a pharmacist assigned to the base hospital. Following my tour of duty with the Air Force, I returned to my hometown, Farmington, New Mexico, where I became an employee and eventually a co-owner of Farmington Drug. With the exception of the 2 years in the U.S. Air Force, I have been a resident of Farmington, New Mexico since 1934. It is my recollection that Dr. Frank B. Nordstrom was the first pediatrician to practice in the Farmington area, and he remained the only pediatrician in Farmington until approximately 1970. I base these recollections on extensive professional and personal contacts with physicians in the Farmington area and as a father of 2 children who were patients of Dr. Nordstrom's. Also based on nearly 40 years of contact with physicians in the Farmington area, I believe that Dr. Nordstrom is the only physician who served a tour of duty at Walker Air Force Base. During the 1960s, I became aware that Dr. Nordstrom had also served at the Walker Air Force Base Hospital. At various times in the ensuing years, Dr. Nordstrom and I reminisced about our service at Walker Air Force Base. During these conversations, Dr. Nordstrom never mentioned any activities during his tour of duty I consider unusual or that might explain reports of bodies or aliens. During the time I was stationed at Walker Air Force Base, I did not witness nor did I hear rumors of anything that involved flying saucers, aliens, or anything else of an extraterrestrial nature. I am not part of a conspiracy to withhold information from either the U.S. government or the American public. There is no classified information that I am withholding related to this inquiry, and I have not been threatened by U.S. government persons concerning not talking about this matter. Signed, Charles E. Clouthier. Statement of Witness. Date 25 May 95. I, Charles A. Coltman, Jr., Colonel, U.S. Air Force, MC, retired, hereby state that James McAndrew was identified as a lieutenant, U.S. Air Force Reserve, on this date at my place of employment, and do hereby, voluntarily and of my own free will, make the following statement. This was done without having been subjected to any coercion, unlawful influence, or unlawful inducement. I entered the U.S. Air Force in 1957 as a flight surgeon and was assigned to Walker Air Force Base, New Mexico in 1958. Following a residency at Ohio State University from 1959 to 1963, I was assigned to Wilford Hall U.S. Air Force Medical Center, Lackland Air Force Base, Texas, where I eventually became the chairman of the Department of Medicine. I retired from the Air Force in 1977. I am presently a professor at the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio and Chief Executive Officer of the Cancer Therapy and Research Foundation of South Texas. I remember a balloon crash that happened north of Roswell, New Mexico in May 1959. I received a phone call from the NCOIC of the Flight Surgeon's Office who informed me of the crash. The NCOIC, Earl Wormwood, came to my quarters and we drove in an old blue Air Force Cracker Box ambulance to the crash site. I remember the gondola laying on its side and the deflated balloon on the ground. The crew members were sitting next to the gondola. I examined the pilots and determined they were not seriously injured, and a gust of wind had dumped them on the ground, and the gondola had struck one of the pilots in the head. Also present were Air Force technicians and trucks who tracked the balloon. The injured pilots were transported to the flight surgeon's office at the hospital at Walker Air Force Base. The injury sustained by the crew member was a head abrasion/contusion and a hematoma. The hematoma caused the patient's head to swell. However, it was not serious enough for him to be admitted. I remember receiving a call from Colonel Dr. John Stapp. He was in charge of the balloon project and was quite famous. Dr. Stapp inquired about the injuries to the pilots, and he wanted them returned to Holloman Air Force Base as quickly as possible. The hospital was an old World War II cantonment-type building with long corridors and a capacity of 50 beds. I do not recall a nurse assisting me in the treatment of the patient, although a nurse may have been on duty and observed the patient. I was the only doctor in the hospital that morning. There were no visiting doctors from other bases or facilities. I do not remember any altercations or arguments that day. During my time at Walker, I do not recall that any autopsies were performed at the hospital, since we did not have a pathologist on staff. I do not recall any remains brought to the hospital in body bags or wreckage transported in the back of an ambulance. There may have been remains brought to the hospital in body bags after a KC-97 crash, but that was before I arrived at Walker. Dr. Ed Bradley was involved in the recovery of the remains. At no time was there ever any involvement of the Walker Hospital with UFOs or space aliens. I know this to be true because the hospital was very small and had a small staff. If any activity other than normal hospital functions had occurred, I would have known about it. I am not part of any conspiracy to withhold or provide misleading information to the United States government or the American public. There is no classified information that I am withholding related to this inquiry, and I have never been threatened by U.S. government persons concerning refraining from talking about this matter. Signed, Charles A. Coltman, Jr., M.D. Statement of Witness. Date, 25 May, 95. I, Dan D. Fulgham, Colonel, U.S. Air Force retired, hereby state that James McAndrew was identified as a Lieutenant, U.S. Air Force Reserve, on this date at my place of employment, and do hereby voluntarily and of my own free will make the following statement. This was done without having been subjected to any coercion, unlawful influence, or unlawful inducement. I entered the U.S. Air Force in 1952 as an aviation cadet. I flew F-84s on 100 combat missions during the Korean War. After a tour as a flight instructor, I was assigned to the Aeromedical Laboratory at Wright-Patterson. I participated in both the Air Force Man in Space program and Project Mercury. I also participated in the X-15 and X-20 programs and worked as a bioastronautics officer with NASA on Gemini. During my Air Force career, I earned both a master's and doctorate degree from Purdue University. I flew a combat tour in Southeast Asia in F-4s as a member of the 555th Tactical Fighter Squadron and flew 133 combat missions. I retired from the Air Force in 1978 as the commander of the Human Resources Laboratory at Brooks Air Force Base, Texas. I am presently the Director of Biosciences for a research organization in San Antonio, Texas. In 1959, I volunteered for training to become a backup pilot for Captain Joe Kittinger in his high-altitude balloon projects. I flew 2 missions for training purposes with Captain Kittinger and Captain Bill Kaufman from Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico in May 1959. On the second flight, we were practicing touch-and-go landings north of Roswell, New Mexico when we crashed on one of the landings. The gondola flipped over and my head was pinned to the ground by the lip of the gondola. We managed to lift the gondola off my head and looked it over for damage. Captain Kittinger was bleeding from a cut on his face, and I noticed that my head seemed to be protruding outward from underneath my helmet. Realizing I was injured, I sat down and I feared I might go into shock. I was not in pain, but my entire head was throbbing and began to swell. I then remember boarding the chase helicopter that was following us and flying a short distance to Walker Air Force Base for medical treatment. I recall walking into the hospital and also stopping on the front step to smoke a cigarette. I remember security personnel escorting and questioning us to determine who we were. Security was very tight at Strategic Air Command bases such as Walker. On occasion, surprise inspection teams from SAC headquarters arrived in helicopters just as we did. In addition, the story of 3 Air Force officers crashing in a balloon was somewhat far-fetched. The security people were convinced of our identities when they spoke with Colonel